In February of 2001, FBI agents arrested one of their own colleagues in a park in Vienna, Virginia, moments after he had left a package of classified documents at a dead-drop location used by Russian intelligence. The man they arrested was Robert Hanssen, a 56-year-old supervisory special agent who had spent 25 years inside the FBI, including assignments in the very counterintelligence division responsible for catching Soviet and Russian spies. He had been selling secrets to Moscow since 1979. For 22 years he had passed to the KGB and its successor, the SVR, some of the most sensitive intelligence in American history, the identities of Soviet agents working for the United States, the details of American nuclear war planning, the existence of a secret tunnel the FBI had dug under the Soviet embassy in Washington, and the technical specifications of American signals intelligence collection systems. At least 3 men were executed by the Soviet Union as a direct result of information Robert Hanssen provided. Others were imprisoned. Entire intelligence programs that had taken years and hundreds of millions of dollars to build were compromised overnight. He was never caught through any failure of tradecraft. He was caught because he asked for his pension early. To understand how the most damaging spy in FBI history operated undetected for 22 years inside the agency, responsible for catching spies, you need to understand not just Robert Hanssen the man, but the system that failed to see him and why that failure was not accidental. Welcome back to Cold War Vault. Every week we open a new file. The secrets just got buried. We dig them up. Robert Philip Hanssen was born in Chicago in 1944, the only child of a Chicago police officer named Howard Hanssen, a man described by those who knew him as demanding, critical, and emotionally withholding. The relationship between father and son left marks that psychologists who later examined Hanssen's case found consistently significant. A deep need for recognition combined with a profound contempt for authority, a belief that he was smarter than the people around him, combined with a chronic inability to receive the acknowledgement he felt he deserved. Hanssen was by any measure genuinely intelligent. He earned a degree in chemistry from Knox College, then an MBA from Northwestern, then a dental degree that he never used, then a law degree, then joined the Chicago Police Department, as his father had done before quitting after 3 years to join the FBI in 1976. The pattern of beginning and abandoning credentials was characteristic. He was drawn to markers of achievement, but consistently found the institutions that conferred them inadequate, populated by people less capable than himself who nonetheless outranked him. At the FBI he was regarded as technically brilliant and personally difficult. Colleagues described him as arrogant, dismissive, and socially awkward, a man who made little effort to conceal his contempt for those he considered his intellectual inferiors, which was most people. He was passed over for promotions he believed he deserved. He was transferred between assignments in ways he experienced as slights. He was, by his own account and the account of those who worked with him, a man perpetually convinced that the institution he served had failed to recognize his worth. He was also, throughout his adult life, a deeply religious man, a convert to Opus Dei, the conservative Catholic organization whose outward piety was genuine and whose personal conduct was, by the standards of that piety, frequently and significantly contradictory. He shared explicit details of his sexual life with a close friend without his wife's knowledge. He took a stripper he had befriended to Hong Kong on FBI business. He gave a Russian handler more than $800,000 in cash and diamonds over 22 years, while simultaneously attending daily mass and sending his 6 children to Catholic school on his government salary. The contradiction was not hypocrisy in the simple sense. Hanssen appears to have genuinely believed in the religious framework he inhabited, while simultaneously living outside it in ways he compartmentalized with complete effectiveness. That capacity for compartmentalization, for maintaining entirely separate behavioral and moral frameworks in different domains of his life without apparent cognitive dissonance, was the same capacity that allowed him to work inside the FBI's counterintelligence division while simultaneously betraying it to Moscow. Hanssen made his first contact with Soviet intelligence in 1979, 3 years after joining the FBI. He was 35 years old, assigned to the New York field office, and working in a division that gave him access to sensitive counterintelligence information about Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. His approach to the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, was unsolicited, and by the standards of professional espionage, extraordinarily amateurish. He simply wrote a letter offering his services and delivered it to a GRU officer he had identified through his FBI work. He did not use a cutout. He did not establish a cover identity. He offered to provide classified information in exchange for money, and he specified the amount he wanted. What saved him from immediate exposure was not tradecraft, but luck. The GRU officer he contacted did not immediately report the contact to KGB counterintelligence as Soviet procedure required, because doing so would have meant sharing a potentially valuable asset with a rival intelligence service. By the time the contact was processed through proper channels, Hanssen had already provided enough valuable intelligence to establish his bona fides and had begun imposing his own operational security requirements on the relationship. Those requirements revealed something important about Hanssen's psychological makeup. He insisted from the beginning that his handlers never attempt to identify him. He communicated exclusively through dead drops, physical locations where packages of documents and payments in cash and diamonds could be left and retrieved without either party being present simultaneously. He refused to meet his handlers in person throughout the entire 22 years of his espionage career. He communicated by typewritten letter rather than electronically, knowing that electronic communications were more easily traced. He used a pseudonym, Ramon Garcia, that he maintained consistently throughout. He also stopped spying in 1981, apparently of his own volition, for reasons that have never been fully explained. He resumed in 1985, this time approaching the KGB directly rather than the GRU, and remained active until his arrest in 2001. The 6-year pause, like much about Hanssen, resists simple explanation. Some analysts have suggested he stopped because his wife discovered his espionage activities and he promised to cease. Others have suggested the pause was strategic, allowing any investigation that might have been triggered by his initial contact to conclude before he resumed. Hanssen himself gave inconsistent accounts. What is clear is that when he resumed in 1985, he provided the KGB with a package of intelligence so comprehensive and so damaging that it immediately established him as one of the most valuable sources Moscow had ever recruited inside American intelligence. The damage assessment that followed Hanssen's arrest took years to complete and remains partially classified. What has been publicly established represents one of the most comprehensive intelligence disasters in American history. In 1985, the year Hanssen resumed his espionage, he provided the KGB with the identities of every Soviet official he was aware of who was working as an agent for American intelligence. 3 of those men, Valery Martinov, Sergei Motorin, and Dmitry Polyakov, were subsequently arrested, tried in secret, and executed. Polyakov, a GRU general who had been providing intelligence to the CIA for more than 2 decades, and whom CIA Director James Woolsey later called the crown jewel of American intelligence assets, was shot in 1988. He had survived undetected for 25 years. Hanssen's letter to the KGB ended his life within 3 years. The human cost of this single act is difficult to overstate. These were men who had chosen, at extraordinary personal risk, to provide intelligence to the United States because they believed in what they were doing. They were identified, arrested, and killed, not because of any failure of their own tradecraft, but because a man who worked for the organization responsible for protecting them had sold their names for money. Beyond the human cost, Hanssen provided the KGB with intelligence about American nuclear war planning. Specifically, the continuity of government programs that specified how the United States government would function and communicate after a nuclear attack. He provided details of the National Intelligence Program budget, giving Moscow a comprehensive picture of where American intelligence resources were being allocated. He revealed the existence of a signals intelligence collection program, codenamed Absorb, and the technical details of how American intelligence was intercepting Soviet communications. Most damaging in the long term was his revelation of a tunnel. The FBI and NSA had spent years and enormous resources digging a tunnel under the Soviet embassy in Washington, designed to intercept communications from the embassy's secure communication systems. The tunnel was among the most expensive and technically ambitious intelligence collection operations the United States had ever undertaken. Hanssen told Moscow about it before it was even completed. The Soviets, aware of the tunnel from the moment it became operational, used it to feed disinformation to American intelligence for years, while never revealing that they knew it existed, because revealing their knowledge would have revealed that they had a source inside American intelligence. The tunnel was not discovered to be compromised until after Hanssen's arrest. For years, American intelligence analysts had been making assessments based partly on information collected through a channel that Moscow had been actively manipulating. The question of why Robert Hanssen was not caught for 22 years is more disturbing than the question of what he did, because the answer implicates not just individual failures, but structural ones that existed by design. The FBI in the Cold War era operated under a culture of institutional insularity that made internal investigation of its own personnel exceptionally difficult. The agency had been built around J. Edgar Hoover's conviction that the FBI was categorically different from the CIA and other intelligence agencies, more trustworthy, more professional, more loyal. That conviction had calcified into an institutional culture in which the suggestion that an FBI agent might be a spy was itself treated as a kind of slander. The FBI did not conduct routine polygraph examinations of its agents during most of Hanssen's career. The CIA did. The NSA did. The FBI considered polygraphs an insult to the integrity of its personnel and resisted their implementation for decades. When polygraphs were eventually introduced, Hanssen passed them because he had studied the literature on polygraph countermeasures and knew how to manage his physiological responses. The FBI also did not conduct the kind of financial monitoring of its personnel that might have flagged Hanssen's unexplained income. Over 22 years, he received more than $1.4 million in cash and diamonds from Moscow. He used the money carefully, avoiding large purchases that might attract attention, but he did send his children to private Catholic schools on a government salary, renovate his house, and maintain a lifestyle that was noticeably comfortable for his income level. No one investigated. The compartmentalization that made Hanssen so effective as a spy also made him difficult to investigate. He knew which programs were being monitored, which communication channels were being watched, and which investigative techniques the FBI used to identify moles, because catching moles was part of his job. He used that knowledge systematically to stay outside the perimeter of any investigation that might have caught him. There were warnings. In the early 1990s, an FBI agent named Jim Olsen became suspicious of Hanssen's behavior and reported his concerns to supervisors. The concerns were not acted upon. In the late 1990s, a separate investigation into intelligence leaks identified Hanssen as a possible suspect, but could not establish sufficient evidence to pursue the case aggressively. The institutional reluctance to investigate a senior agent, combined with Hanssen's own knowledge of investigative procedures, created a protective barrier that persisted for 2 decades. What finally broke that barrier was money. In the late 1990s, the FBI authorized a payment of more than $7 million to a former Russian intelligence officer who provided the agency with a KGB file on their mole inside American intelligence. The file did not contain Hanssen's name. It contained his fingerprints on a plastic bag, a DNA sample, and enough operational details to identify him conclusively. The former Russian officer also provided a recording of Hanssen's voice. Hanssen was placed under surveillance. On February 18, 2001, he drove to Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia, and left a package at a dead drop. FBI agents arrested him as he walked back to his car. His first words upon arrest were reported to be, "What took you so long?" Hanssen pleaded guilty in July 2001 to 15 counts of espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage, avoiding the death penalty in exchange for his cooperation with a damage assessment. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and died in federal custody in June 2023. The damage assessment he cooperated with revealed something that the FBI found deeply uncomfortable. The structural vulnerabilities that Hanssen had exploited were not unique to him. They were features of the institutional culture that had allowed him to operate, and many of them persisted after his arrest because they were embedded in how the agency understood itself. The reforms that followed Hanssen's arrest were substantial. The FBI implemented mandatory polygraph examinations for all personnel with access to sensitive, compartmented information. It established a financial monitoring program for agents in sensitive positions. It created a dedicated counterintelligence division with explicit authority to investigate FBI personnel. It improved information sharing with the CIA and other intelligence agencies, addressing the institutional rivalry that had historically made coordinated mole hunting difficult. But the deeper lesson of the Hanssen case resists institutional solution. Hanssen was not simply a man who exploited gaps in procedure. He was a man whose intelligence, knowledge of the system, and capacity for compartmentalization made him precisely the kind of threat that procedural reforms are least effective against. Every reform the FBI implemented after his arrest was designed to catch the next Hanssen by closing the gaps the first one used. The next Hanssen, if there is one, will use different gaps, because the next Hanssen will also be someone whose job involves knowing where the gaps are. The three men who were executed because of Robert Hanssen's espionage are the part of this story that resists resolution. Valery Martinov, Sergei Motorin, and Dmitry Polyakov chose to take extraordinary risks in service of something they believed in. They survived those risks for years. They were undone not by anything they did, but by a man they had never met, working inside the organization that was supposed to protect them, who valued their lives less than the money and the intellectual satisfaction of outwitting the system he served. Hanssen was asked in his post-arrest debriefings why he had done it. His answers were inconsistent and self-serving. He spoke of financial pressure, though the money he received was far more than he needed. He spoke of ideological disillusionment, though he showed little evidence of political conviction in any direction. He spoke of the intellectual challenge, the satisfaction of operating successfully inside a system that considered itself impenetrable. The most honest answer he gave may have been the simplest. He did it because he could, and because no one stopped him, and because for 22 years, that was enough. Robert Hanssen spent 22 years walking into FBI headquarters every morning, collecting his badge, sitting at his desk in the counterintelligence division, and going home in the evening, knowing what he had done and what he continued to do. He attended Mass daily. He coached his children's sports teams. He was, by every outward measure, a loyal government servant and a devoted family man. The distance between the person he appeared to be and the person he was is the measure of what compartmentalization can do to a human life, and what it can do to the institutions that trust the humans inside them. Next week, we open a file that has been buried deeper than almost any other in Cold War history. In 1954, the CIA began a program so secret that even its existence was denied for decades, a program that used American citizens as unwitting test subjects for experiments in mind control, interrogation enhancement, and behavioral manipulation. The program was called MKultra. It was shut down in 1973. Most of its records were destroyed. What survived is enough to make everything you thought you knew about the limits of what governments do to their own people considerably less certain. Subscribe to Cold War Vault. The secrets just got buried. We dig them up.